In 546 BCE, Sardis fell, and Persia inherited the richest minting tradition in Anatolia. In September 522 BCE, Darius seized a throne surrounded by revolt. Within a generation, a small gold coin would begin to do what armies alone could never finish: teach 3 continents to trust one measure of value. This is not only the story of Persian power, it is the story of a financial idea that still rules the modern world. An empire grows fastest when strangers believe the money in their hands will mean the same thing tomorrow. But before gold could become the language of empire, trade had to struggle through a slower, heavier world, one built on barter, weighing, and uncertainty. Long before the Daric shone in Persian gold, trade moved at the pace of burden and suspicion. In the markets of Mesopotamia and Western Asia, a farmer might bring barley, oil, or wool, only to discover that the other side wanted something else entirely. Value existed, but it did not yet travel lightly. Silver could be weighed and metal could be tested, yet every important exchange still demanded time, tools, and trust at close range. Wealth in that world was not only what you owned, but how easily you could turn it into something another person would accept. A civilization could build roads, granaries, and temples, but without a common measure of value, distance remained expensive. By the late 7th century BCE, Western Anatolia was moving toward a new answer. The question was no longer whether money was needed, but where authority would first stamp its promise onto metal. That answer appeared in Lydia, in the rich river valleys of Western Anatolia. True coinage had already begun in Asia Minor soon after 650 BCE, but under Croesus, who reigned about 560 to 546 BCE, stamped money reached a cleaner and more legible form. His famous lion and bull coins, first in electrum and then in a purer gold and silver system, offered something barter never could: a visible royal guarantee. A merchant no longer had to begin every major exchange from zero. The mark on the metal had already done part of the work. Around 550 BCE, Croesus also financed the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, a reminder that monetary credibility can become monumental power. Yet Lydia was still only a regional kingdom. Its breakthrough was brilliant, but limited. In 546 BCE, Sardis fell, and the Lydian solution passed into hands large enough to test it against empire. When Sardis fell in about 546 BCE, Cyrus II did not inherit only land, tribute, and storehouses. Persia also inherited the most advanced minting tradition in Anatolia. That detail mattered. Cyrus was building a realm that, in time, reached from the Indus Valley to the Aegean, and such a realm could not live forever on conquest alone. Armies can seize cities, but they cannot by themselves standardize exchange between distant peoples who speak different languages and keep different local measures. What Lydia had proven on a regional scale was now available to a power far larger. After the conquest of Lydia, Persia possessed the monetary technology that an empire of scale would eventually need. The gold idea was now inside the imperial system. The harder problem was no longer invention. It was administration. How could one court calculate value across a world too large to count by sight? By the time Darius emerged, the empire was already too vast for improvisation. From Susa, imperial authority reached toward Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus. Tribute came in different forms, local traditions remained strong, and distance magnified every small inconsistency. Grain from one province did not translate neatly into silver from another. A governor could report abundance, yet the center might still struggle to compare one region's yield with another's. Finance, at that scale, was more than money. A large state needed units, schedules, routes, and records before it could even know what it possessed. The Persian problem, then, was not merely wealth, but comparability. Without standards, even a rich empire can become blind to its own resources. Persia had conquered faster than it had standardized. The empire did not need another cavalry charge. It needed a ruler who could turn power into system. In September 522 BCE, that ruler seized the throne. Darius I came to power in September 522 BCE amid crisis, and by 519 BCE, he had broken the major revolts that threatened to tear the empire apart. Only then could he begin the quieter conquest that mattered just as much: administrative order. Darius did not invent coinage, but he recognized that tribute, roads, weights, and royal authority had to be tightened into one financial structure. By the last decade of the 6th century BCE, his reforms were pushing the empire toward a more uniform fiscal world, and the archer-type Daric appears to have been introduced soon after 515 BCE, certainly by 500 or 499 BCE. Under Darius, Persia began turning inherited wealth into controlled value. A strong money is not born from metal alone, but from a state able to defend standards across distance. The next question was exact, almost mechanical, and therefore revolutionary. What weight of value could an empire trust? When Darius's monetary reform finally took shape toward the end of the 6th century BCE, it rested on a discipline small enough to fit in a human palm. The Gold Daric weighed about 8.4 grams, roughly 1 Babylonian shekel, and its gold was refined to about 98% purity. That combination mattered more than decoration. A coin becomes powerful when strangers no longer need to renegotiate its substance every time it changes hands. Good money lowers the cost of doubt. A merchant in western Anatolia did not have to ask whether the gold was honest before deciding whether the trade was worthwhile. The standard had already done that work. Under Darius, value was no longer merely stored in metal. It was compressed into a repeatable rule. But a rule this precise needed an image just as disciplined, because the empire did not want its money only to weigh correctly, it wanted its authority to be recognized instantly. That answer appeared on the face of the coin itself. The fundamental Achaemenid type was the royal archer, the Persian king shown with bow, and in later variations with spear or in a running kneeling stance. Greek speakers would eventually nickname these coins toxotai, archers. The image mattered because imperial money had to do two jobs at once. It had to measure value, and it had to signal authority. In a world without passports, newspapers, or central bank seals, the coin had to carry the state inside its own image. The Daric, therefore, moved through markets as both metal and message. Its weight reassured the hand. Its icon reassured the eye. The design was not decoration in the shallow sense. It was part of the infrastructure of trust. And once the archer could be recognized at a glance, the next question became geographical rather than symbolic. How far could such recognition travel before empire itself began to feel like market? Its reach was impressive, but it must be described with care. The Daric did become a highly prestigious trade coin, especially across the western part of the Persian Empire and Asia Minor, and it was found far beyond its core zone. Yet it did not replace every local economy. Its real power lay elsewhere. It provided a trusted, high-value standard for large payments, stored wealth, and long-distance exchange. The strongest currency in a pre-modern world does not need to dominate every small market in order to shape the larger system. The Daric helped bind Western imperial commerce because merchants trusted its purity more than many local alternatives. In that sense, it functioned less like daily pocket money and more like a prestige instrument of settlement. Once such a standard exists, trade begins to lean on infrastructure. And in Persia, that infrastructure had a name: the Royal Road. The Royal Road turned imperial distance into administrative rhythm. Running from Susa across Anatolia toward Sardis, it stretched for more than 2,400 kilometers, and ancient calculation places the full route at about 2,600 kilometers. Darius did not build every section from nothing, but he organized, restored, and integrated the route into an imperial communications system. A coin can promise value, but a state must still move messages, orders, inspectors, and merchants across the terrain that gives the promise credibility. The Royal Road did that work. It was not merely a road for armies, it was a corridor for synchronization. Standards become real only when the center can reach the edge before confusion hardens into local habit. And once the road existed, distance could finally be measured not only in miles, but in time. Ancient writers described the Royal Road with 111 royal post stations, spaced across the route from Susa to Sardis. Herodotus says the full journey, which ordinary travelers might need about 3 months to complete, could be crossed by royal couriers in about 1 week, while later summaries often give 9 days for the mounted relay. The exact reconstruction of every segment is debated, but the administrative meaning is not. This was an early machine for compressing time. Markets deepen when information arrives faster than rumor. A tax order, a standard of weight, or a warning from the center loses power if it reaches the provinces too late. Persia's road solved part of that problem by making imperial communication predictable. Once time itself became more manageable, the empire could begin comparing provinces with greater confidence. And that is where roads, money, and government finally meet, in the ability to measure a large world as if it were one system. Once the Royal Road compressed distance, Persia could begin to measure its world with greater clarity. Greek sources famously preserve Darius's empire as a system of 20 tribute-bearing districts, each expected to deliver revenue on a fixed annual basis. Egypt, together with Libya, Cyrene, and Barca, paid 700 talents of silver. India, the richest district in Herodotus's account, paid 360 Euboean talents of gold dust. Empire becomes governable when revenue stops behaving like a gift and starts behaving like a schedule. A king cannot plan roads, garrisons, or palaces with vague generosity. He needs recurring numbers. Under Darius, tribute was no longer only submission, it became forecastable cash flow. And once revenue could be compared across distant provinces, a deeper problem emerged at once. If silver in one region and gold in another were both entering the same imperial ledger, what standard could make those figures speak the same language? In the Persian world, gold coinage was more than payment. It was a signature of sovereignty. The Daric was royal coinage, struck from very pure gold and tied directly to the authority of the great king. That is why later acts of satrapal gold minting were read as political defiance. In the 4th century BCE, the satrap Orontes even struck his own gold coinage in open challenge to Artaxerxes. The implication was clear. Gold, above all, belonged to the king's symbolic monopoly. To accept the Daric was to accept not merely metal, but hierarchy. It was to recognize that value itself had been marked by royal authority. Once that link between gold and kingship had been established, one problem still remained. A king could define value, but how could he persuade merchants that his power was not only distant, but protective? A strong coin cannot keep its prestige if the roads beneath it are ruled by fear. In the Achaemenid system, the satrap was responsible for internal security, and the imperial roads were carefully controlled and supervised by patrols. The Royal Road itself linked Susa to Sardis across more than 2,400 kilometers, making communication and enforcement faster than most ancient states could imagine. A merchant does not measure a coin only by purity. He also measures the danger of carrying it. Persia's great advantage was not that violence vanished, but that imperial order lowered uncertainty enough for long-distance trade to feel calculable. When danger becomes more predictable, capital travels farther. but orders spread across such a large empire could not depend on local goodwill alone. It needed surprise, oversight, and the possibility of sudden royal scrutiny. That scrutiny had a name in Greek tradition: the king's eyes and the king's ears. Ironica describes these officials as royal inspectors who traveled across the empire, often with troops sufficient for immediate action, paid unexpected visits, examined satrapal conduct, and reported directly back to the king. Trust at scale decays when every provincial governor knows exactly when inspection will come. Persia's solution was not modern bureaucracy in our sense, but it was a remarkably early imperial answer to the problem of delegated power. The center could not be everywhere, so it built channels through which the king could suddenly appear in administrative form. Once tribute, standards, roads, and inspection were tied together, the empire possessed something rarer than gold itself: controllable revenue. And controllable revenue could now be transformed into the thing that kept empire alive: paid force. Once revenue became more predictable, Persia could sustain something rarer than conquest: permanence in arms. Greek tradition remembers the immortals as an elite force of 10,000, their number restored whenever death, illness, or injury removed a man from the ranks. They formed the core of the Achaemenid standing army, and 1,000 of them served as the king's personal guard. Durable power depends not only on bravery, but on repeatable funding. A tribal levy can win a battle. A state with controllable revenue can hold an empire. Persia's achievement was not that it invented war, but that it tied military continuity to administrative continuity. Tribute, roads, standards, and inspection all converged here in the ability to keep trained force available beyond the rhythm of a single season. Yet armies do not exist for themselves. Once protected, the imperial system could reach more deeply into trade, labor, and daily life across 3 continents. That wider life did not form a perfectly uniform common market, and it should not be described that way. But the Achaemenid Empire did link territories in Asia, Africa, and Europe through roads, tribute, military service, and a prestigious high-value coinage whose darics became the gold standard across the Western Empire and Asia Minor. Integration does not require sameness to matter. A large system becomes economically powerful when enough frictions are lowered for goods, orders, and obligations to move more predictably. Persia achieved that without erasing local cultures or local economic habits. In many places, daily exchange still relied on local practice and payments in kind. Yet the imperial layer above that local world became easier to coordinate. Trade coins, tax flows, and royal roads gave distant regions a shared frame of reference. And where does a system like that make itself visible in stone? At Persepolis, where empire turned administration into architecture. Persepolis was not simply a city. It was an imperial statement in stone, begun under Darius in the late 6th century BCE, and used above all as a royal and ceremonial center. Its treasury mattered because it made accumulation visible. Later classical tradition, cited by Ironica, reports that when Alexander took Persepolis in 330 BCE, the treasure found there amounted to 120,000 talents, with the gold estimated in terms of silver. That figure belongs to the literary tradition and should be used as such, not as a modern, audited balance sheet. Reserves matter not only because they exist, but because they can be imagined. A treasury anchors confidence when subjects believe the center possesses depth beyond the coin in their own hand. Yet hoarded wealth alone is never the whole story. Someone still had to record disbursements, rations, and obligations with enough discipline to make imperial wealth usable. The clay records from Persepolis show a disciplined fiscal world, but they must not be modernized beyond the evidence. The Persepolis treasury texts deal mainly with payments of silver made from the treasury in lieu of partial or full rations of sheep, wine, or grain to workers and craftsmen active at or near Persepolis. They also include letters ordering payments and memoranda confirming that those payments were made. States become powerful when records turn resources into obligations that can be checked. That is already a remarkable achievement. There is no need to call it double-entry bookkeeping, because it was not. The stronger historical point is that Achaemenid administration used written records to convert labor, ration, and silver into a governable pattern. And once revenue and labor could be recorded with discipline, the empire's real wealth came back into view, the agricultural base that made taxes possible in the first place. Beneath the fiscal order of empire lay something quieter: water. The Qanat was an ancient Iranian water supply system that tapped underground mountain sources and carried the flow through gently sloping tunnels, often for several kilometers, while reducing evaporation in arid land. Britannica places the development of Qanats roughly 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. That means the safest historical claim is not that Darius invented the system, but that empires like his depended on agricultural landscapes made more productive by technologies of this kind. Money is strongest when it rests on recurring real output. A coin may be minted in gold, but taxes are ultimately paid out of grain, labor, orchards, herds, and water. Irrigation made settlement more durable, and durable settlement made revenue less fragile. Once the land could yield more reliably, surplus could begin its long movement toward the western markets of the empire. When surplus left the irrigated lands of the empire, it did not move only by caravan. It also moved by sea. After 538 BCE, Phoenicia passed achaemenid Achaemenid rule, and its great coastal cities, especially Sidon and Tyre, remained important maritime centers. Sidon was famous for purple dyes and glassware, while Tyre continued to flourish under Persian rule even after losing its older hegemony. The Persian kings also drew major naval strength from Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Egypt. Maritime trade expands fastest when political protection, port access, and trusted payment reinforce one another. The Daric did not erase every local habit of exchange, but it belonged to the high-value layer of a world where ships, duties, and imperial order increasingly met at the harbor. And once wealth began arriving by both road and sea, the question changed again. Where exactly did the empire gather and hold what it could now command? The answer was not a single magical vault, but a royal treasury system anchored in more than one center. Susa served as the administrative capital of Darius and his successors from 522 BCE, while Persepolis, begun under Darius, functioned above all as a royal and ceremonial center. Iranica preserves the title Ganzabara, treasurer, for financial administrators attached to Achaemenid treasuries. Reserves matter most when they are institutionally managed, not merely physically hoarded. Imperial wealth was concentrated enough to be governed through offices, archives, and royal centers. Later evidence of scale is striking. After Alexander's conquest, Susa yielded 50,000 gold talents in treasure. That number belongs to the end of the empire, but it reveals the depth such royal centers could hold. The next problem, however, was not storage. It was conversion. How could gold and silver circulate together without pulling prices into chaos? That conversion rested on one of the clearest numerical rules in the Achaemenid system. 20 sigloi were equivalent to 1 daric. The daric weighed 8.4 grams, the siglos about 11.2 grams, and the theoretical ratio of silver to gold value in the system was about 13.3 to 1. Markets grow calmer when conversion rules are simple enough to remember and solid enough to trust. A merchant did not need to reinvent the relationship between high-value gold and everyday silver in every city he entered. The imperial standard had already done part of that work. Fixed ratios do not eliminate all monetary stress, but they do reduce quoting friction and calculation costs across distance. And once coinage, tribute, and exchange rates all began speaking in numbers that aligned, a broader kind of stability became possible. The stability born not from perfection, but from predictability. That predictability did not mean that every village in the empire suddenly lived by one identical economic script. Local habits, payments in kind, and regional practices endured. What changed was the imperial layer above them. Beginning around 519 BCE, Darius's tax reforms regularized assessment, while around 515 BCE, the shekel standard of about 8.40 grams was enforced across the empire's weight system. Stability did not require total uniformity. It required enough standardization at the coordinating layer of the system. That was where great states earned their advantage. They did not erase variation. They made variation governable. Under Darius, coinage, weights, measures, tax schedules, and royal roads increasingly worked together, and state income also drew from port and market duties alongside direct taxes. Once uncertainty fell at that upper level, the empire could look farther east with greater confidence. Beyond those eastern horizons lay a world that would later be connected by names Persia itself never used. To call Darius the architect of the Silk Road would be too early. The Silk Road, in the sense most people recognize, belongs to a later historical horizon, linking China and the Western world more fully than the Achaemenids ever did. Yet it would be equally wrong to treat the Achaemenid East as unrelated to what followed. Persia created a disciplined imperial framework across Iran, toward Bactria, the Indus, and the Central Asian approaches, a world in which roots, tribute, standards, and demand could later extend farther than the empire itself. The most important systems in history often begin as preconditions, not as finished names. Persia did not create the Silk Road in the textbook sense. What it created was a scale of organization that made later connectivity easier to imagine. And that is the perfect threshold for the next chapter. When does an imperial coin stop being merely Persian and begin behaving like a currency beyond borders? By the 5th century BCE, the Daric was doing something few coins of the ancient world could do. It was moving across political borders without surrendering its identity. Ironica notes that the Persian Darikos circulated so widely among Greeks that in popular speech it was called toxotai, archers, after the image on the coin. By 429/8 BCE, the name already appears in the accounts of the temple treasury of Athena Parthenos at Athens. A strong currency does not need to abolish borders in order to become bigger than them. It only needs to remain legible when it crosses them. The Daric did not erase local coinages, but it entered Greek awareness as a recognizable gold standard from outside the polis world. Once that happened, Persia possessed something subtler than conquest. It possessed a coin that could arrive before its soldiers and remain after they had gone. In Greek markets, the Daric was foreign gold with familiar weight. It was Persian in origin, but practical in use. Ironica notes not only that the Daric was known in Athens, but that several Greek states in the 5th century minted on a Persian standard, even while paying tribute to the Delian League. Markets often adopt a rival's standard before they accept the rival's power. Traders care first about reliability, only then about ideology. That is why Persian monetary influence could spread even where Persian political prestige did not. The Daric was not everyday small change in every Greek city. That would say too much. But as a high-value reference coin, it had crossed into Greek financial life. And when foreign money becomes useful enough to be imitated, it stops being merely imported wealth. It becomes a benchmark. By the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE, Persian gold was no longer only a monetary fact. It had become a geopolitical instrument inside Greece. The famous Persian archers, the Achaemenid gold coins bearing an archer, were used with considerable skill in bribing first one Greek state and then another. Plutarch later preserves the bitter Spartan memory of this strategy. When Agesilaus was forced to break camp in Asia, he remarked that the great king was driving him out with 10,000 archers, meaning coins, not soldiers. Money becomes strategic when it can rearrange the choices of other states without first defeating their armies. A sword can win a field. Gold can redirect a coalition. And once a coin can do that, it no longer belongs only to economics. It belongs to statecraft. That statecraft worked because Persia did not always seek total victory for one side. It often sought balance. The Persians first encouraged Athens against Sparta, and later, after the Athenian disaster in Sicily in 413 BCE, intervened on Sparta's side. By the Treaty of Miletus in 412 BCE, Persian support for Spartan seamen helped Persia recover freedom of action in Western Asia Minor. Later still, Persian money helped fuel resistance to Sparta on Greek soil, and by 387/386 BCE, the king's peace allowed Artaxerxes to dictate terms to the Greek world. Financial diplomacy is strongest when it does not buy love, only leverage. Persia did not need every Greek city to admire it. It needed enough of them to need its gold at the right moment. The answer lies partly in politics, but also in language. Because of the Daric's dominant position as the single, regularly issued gold coin of its time, the Greek word daraikos eventually became a term that could be used more broadly for a gold coin, even for the gold stater of Philip. The highest form of monetary success is reached when a currency's name begins to detach itself from its issuing state and attach itself to the category of trust. Gold mattered, of course. Its scarcity and durability made it persuasive. But the Daric's deeper achievement was to combine metal, standard, and political authority so effectively that Greeks could use its name as shorthand for gold value itself. That is when a coin stops being merely Persian. It starts behaving like a monetary language, and the next question is how merchants used that language to manage risk across distance. Distance was the oldest enemy of profit. A caravan leaving Babylonia for the west faced delay, theft, spoilage, and the simple uncertainty of time. The safest way to describe the Persian response is not to call it modern hedging, but to say that the Near Eastern world had already become deeply contractual. By the late Achaemenid period, debt notes, pledges, and silver obligations allowed risk to be written into legal form rather than carried only in memory. Uncertainty becomes more manageable the moment it can be documented. A merchant could not abolish danger, but he could define who owed what, in which medium, and under what conditions. That was an enormous step. Once risk entered the world of written obligation, wealth no longer depended only on courage and transport. It also depended on paperwork, witnesses, and enforceable claims. And from that world of written claims, one family in Nippur would emerge as a perfect guide. That family was the House of Murasu and Sons, based at Nippur in Babylonia. Documents from their business archive survive for roughly 455 to 403 BCE, during the reigns of Artaxerxes I and Darius II. Britannica describes them as a family banking business that prospered by lending money and by acting as a middleman in the system of tax collection. Finance becomes powerful when it learns to stand between the state and the producer. The Murasu firm did not mint royal gold, and it did not rule the empire, but it occupied a position that matters in every age, the zone where administration, taxation, land, and credit meet. By the 5th century BCE, private financial intermediation inside the Persian imperial world had become sophisticated enough to leave a documentary shadow that still feels modern. And once intermediation becomes powerful, the price of time itself steps forward. Credit gave the Persian world something metal alone never could: time. A loan allowed seed to be planted, taxes to be met, or obligations to be postponed until harvest or collection. Interest rates were high, but borrowers were numerous. Broader Mesopotamian practice often worked with rates of about 20% on silver loans and roughly 1/3 on barley loans. Figures that make sense in a world where storage, seasonality, and default risk were severe. Interest is the price paid to bridge the gap between need now and income later. Persia did not invent credit. What matters is that under imperial order, old lending practices could expand inside a more stable administrative frame. Once time itself could be bought at a price, monetary influence could travel farther than the coin's own place of origin. And that farther reach becomes easier to see in the East, where Persian influence survived not only in power, but in technique. That farther reach becomes easier to see in the northwest of the Indian world. Several scholars have emphasized the influence of Achaemenid coinage on the form and technique of local punch-marked coinage of Indian weight standard. The influence did not end with the fall of the empire. Some coins from Taxila, dated to the end of the 3rd century BCE, still show on the reverse a figure in the guise of an Achaemenid satrap. Monetary power lasts longest when it survives as technique. Even when a ruling house falls, standards of weight, habits of striking, and visual conventions can keep moving through the hands of later peoples. Persia's deepest victory in the East may therefore have been less about direct rule than about numismatic memory. And while those Eastern influences moved through frontier zones and mints, another Persian inheritance was moving westward over water, carried by sailors who knew the sea better than kings knew the land. Westward, Persia's reach depended on sailors. After 538 BCE, Phoenicia passed under Achaemenid rule, and cities such as Sidon and Tyre remained major maritime centers. Sidon was renowned for purple dyes and glassware, while Tyre continued as a major seaport through the Persian Age. Persian naval power, too, drew heavily from Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Egypt. A currency's reach is multiplied when sea power lowers the cost of moving high-value goods. There is no need to imagine every Phoenician ship paid in darics. The stronger point is that imperial rule, port activity, maritime skill, and trusted high-value money could now reinforce one another across the eastern Mediterranean. Roads had connected the land empire. Sailors gave it a second bloodstream, and once land routes and sea routes both carried imperial value, the story was ready to move from trade to monument, from moving wealth to spending it on the face of the earth. Imperial wealth did not remain invisible for long. Under Darius, revenue was turned into stone. Britannica attributes to him the fortifications, the Apadana, the council hall, the treasury, and a residential palace at Persepolis, though not all were finished in his lifetime. The Persepolis treasury texts also show something even more important than architecture itself. Workers and craftsmen near Persepolis received payments of silver in lieu of part or all of their rations. Some were woodworkers, goldsmiths, and stonecutters, and some are identified as Syrians, Ionians, and Egyptians. Public works are not only displays of glory, they are ways of converting concentrated wealth into organized labor. A coin's true power is revealed when it can leave the treasury, pass through many hands, and become walls, columns, and wages. Yet once wealth begins to move like that, another question becomes more important than splendor itself. How much of the empire's wealth was actually circulating, and how much was lying still? The old picture of Persian wealth as treasure locked away forever is too simple. Iranica records a long scholarly debate on exactly this point. An older theory claimed that precious metal paid as taxes was withdrawn from circulation for decades, draining the economy. But Matthew Stolper's view, summarized there, rejects the idea of a general shortage of specie or broad economic decay in Achaemenid Mesopotamia. Iranica adds that by some calculations, the kings hoarded no more than about 5% of annual tax income, while 95% was put back into circulation. Reserves matter, but liquidity matters more if an empire wants its economy to breathe. Treasury silver that paid workers, supplied officials, or moved through provincial exchange did more than sit in vaults. It kept value in motion. And once circulation itself became part of imperial strength, the empire faced a quieter burden. A system that moves wealth well must also be maintained at great cost. An imperial system is never maintained for free. Darius was remembered not only for coinage and administration, but for great building projects, the Royal Road, and even the completion of the canal project linking the Nile to the Red Sea, which helped connect the eastern and western ends of the empire. At the same time, the state's income was substantial. Beginning around 519 BCE, Darius's tax system brought in 7,740 Babylonian talents of silver per year, not counting the Indian gold dust assessment, and income also came from port and market duties. Infrastructure is expensive, but fragmentation is usually more expensive. Roads, ports, canals, garrisons, treasuries, and administration all consumed resources. Yet they were also the mechanisms that lowered the empire's costs of distance. Persia's challenge was never simply to collect wealth. It was to keep spending enough to preserve order without spending so much that order consumed its own foundation. And where standards, roads, and revenue meet, another concern inevitably appears: the credibility of the metal itself. For a high-value coin, trust could not remain purely symbolic. It had to be testable. One Akkadian Persepolis treasury text records assays of silver payments made in years 19 and 20 of Darius I, that is, 503 to 502 BCE. More broadly, the touchstone was one of the earliest methods used to assess the quality of precious metals. Metal was rubbed on a dark stone and compared with a sample of known purity. A monetary standard grows stronger when ordinary verification does not depend on blind faith alone. The Persian system linked coinage, treasury practice, and assay culture closely enough that purity was something people could examine, not merely admire. In that sense, trust was never only a political emotion, it was also a technical habit. And once the quality of metal can be checked, another question quietly appears behind it. If a system remains stable for generations, how does it respond when markets themselves begin to shift? The Persian monetary system did not collapse in one simple flood of money. The evidence points to something more disciplined and more impressive. In Achaemenid Mesopotamia, the older idea of a general shortage of specie and broad economic decay does not hold up well. Recent work on Persian Anatolia likewise suggests that the empire's bimetallic system was flexible, responsive to changing market conditions, and capable of operating for 2 centuries without major crisis, even though local silver supplies and commodity prices could still fluctuate. Durable monetary orders do not survive by avoiding every pressure. They survive by adjusting to pressure before it hardens into collapse. Persia's greatness lay not in building a perfect machine, but in building one that could absorb strain for generations. Yet every long-lived system eventually casts a long shadow, because stability invites imitation, rivalry, and, in time, replacement. The clearest measure of Persian monetary genius is not found in a single victory, but in duration. The Daric was introduced by Darius toward the end of the 6th century BCE, and for roughly 2 centuries it remained the most important regularly issued gold coin in its world. Ironica notes that it was eventually displaced first by the gold stater of Philip II of Macedon, and then decisively by the Nike stater of Alexander. The deepest strength of a currency is not excitement, but predictability over generations. A merchant can plan around power when power keeps its standards. That is why Persian monetary order mattered so much. It lasted long enough to become an expectation. And once a coin becomes an expectation, it begins to shape behavior far beyond the land that first struck it. But stability measured in years is not the same thing as unity measured in space. To understand the Persian achievement more clearly, we must now look across the map itself, from Babylon to Egypt. At its height, the Persian Empire connected an extraordinary geographic range. From Egypt to Babylonia, from Asia Minor toward the Indus, imperial rule tied regions together through tribute, roads, military service, and administrative oversight. But it was not a perfectly borderless market. It was something subtler and more realistic, an imperial frame large enough to make distant regions more comparable. Economic power often comes not from making every local exchange identical, but from building a higher layer of coordination above local differences. The Daric served as the gold standard in the Western Empire and Asia Minor, while tribute and royal roads helped the center measure and move value across provinces. That was Persia's great achievement. Yet the wider and stronger that imperial frame became, the more likely it was to collide with another system that refused to be absorbed. That collision would come in Greece. The Greco-Persian Wars, fought from 492 to 449 BCE, are usually remembered as battles of shields, spears, and narrow passes. But beneath that familiar surface lay a struggle between systems of mobilization. Persia was a tribute empire with deep reserves, long roads, and access to manpower and ships from many subject peoples. Greece, by contrast, was politically fragmented, but capable of local naval concentration, civic sacrifice, and fast strategic adaptation. Wealth creates options, but options still depend on how quickly a system can convert money into coordinated action. Persia could finance repeated campaigns, and its navy was drawn heavily from Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Egypt. Yet Greek resistance showed that funding scale is not the same as mastering terrain, timing, and coalition. Gold can buy endurance, it cannot guarantee execution. And nowhere would that truth become more expensive than at sea. War in the Eastern Mediterranean was, above all, a naval expense. The trireme was the principal warship with which Persia, Phoenicia, and the Greek city-states fought for mastery of the sea, and a single vessel required enormous human energy. Britannica notes that the classical trireme relied on 170 oarsmen. Multiply that across hundreds of ships, and naval war becomes a machine for consuming pay, food, timber, and coordination. In complex war, payroll is strategy. Persia's naval strength was real, but it was also costly, because fleets recruited from many regions had to be supplied, moved, and held together. During Xerxes' invasion in 480 BCE, the Persian navy was still immense, about 800 galleys by Britannica's summary. A power that can build and feed such a fleet is rich. A power that can use it decisively is something rarer. And the narrow waters off Salamis would expose the difference. At Salamis in 480 BCE, the Greek fleet defeated the Persian navy in the straits between the island of Salamis and Piraeus. Britannica summarizes the balance starkly. Xerxes had about 800 galleys, while the Greeks had about 370 triremes. Yet the narrower water favored maneuver over mass. The Greeks sank about 300 Persian vessels, while losing only about 40 of their own. Scale is not sovereign if the operating environment punishes scale. Persian wealth had built a giant fleet, but geography and command turned that advantage against it. Salamis did not prove that money was weak. It proved that money has a domain. It is supreme at building capacity, but not at abolishing friction. Once the sea stopped rewarding size, imperial spending could no longer buy the same result. And when a monetary order learns that its reach has limits, the next question is no longer how to fund victory. It is how to survive replacement. Before Alexander replaced the Persian monetary order, his father had already begun to challenge it. Philip II of Macedon, who ruled from 359 to 336 BCE, transformed Macedonia into the power that would break into Asia. Ironica notes that the Daric was eventually displaced from its central economic position, first by the Biga stater of Philip II. A British museum example of Philip's gold stater shows exactly why it mattered: Apollo on the obverse and a Biga on the reverse. Reserve power is first threatened not when an enemy defeats it in battle, but when a rival issues a standard the market can imagine as equal. Philip's gold did not yet destroy Persian prestige, but it announced that Persian gold was no longer alone at the summit. And once a rival coin enters that height of trust, war becomes more than territorial. It becomes a contest over which image will define value in the next generation. When Alexander came to the throne in 336 BCE, he inherited not only Philip's army, but also Philip's financial problem. Britannica states the point bluntly. Alexander needed the wealth of Persia if he was to maintain the army built by Philip and pay off the 500 talents he owed. That single fact makes his Eastern campaign look different. Glory mattered, but liquidity mattered too. Conquest becomes most dangerous when military ambition and financial necessity begin to reinforce each other. Persia was no longer only the enemy of a Greek revenge narrative. It was also the deepest treasury in the known world. After Granicus in 334 BCE and Issus in 333 BCE, Alexander was no longer probing the edge of Persia. He was moving toward the ports, treasuries, and corridors that allowed Persian power to circulate. And that is why the next target was not chosen at random. It was Tyre. In 332 BCE, Alexander completed the 7-month siege of Tyre, a campaign Britannica calls his greatest military achievement. The strategic value of Tyre was larger than the city itself. After Issus, Alexander took Syria and Phoenicia, cutting off the Persian fleet from its ports. One of the fastest ways to weaken a monetary order is not to attack its coin first, but to sever the infrastructure that lets its power move. Tyre was one of the last major Phoenician naval strongholds available to Persia in the region. Once it fell, Persian maritime strength in the eastern Mediterranean was crippled at the source. Alexander did not need to melt a single coin to begin dismantling Persian reach. He only had to close the harbors through which Persian reach had traveled. And with the coast secured, the road to the imperial heartland opened. The decisive break came after Gaugamela on October 1st, 331 BCE, the battle that decided the fate of the Achaemenid Empire. In 330 BCE, Alexander entered Persepolis. Ironica preserves the classical tradition that the treasure found there totaled 120,000 talents, when the gold was estimated in terms of silver. Plutarch adds an unforgettable logistical image. It took 10,000 pairs of mules and 5,000 camels to carry away the rest of the movable wealth and furniture. Reserves are stored power, and conquest can turn stored power into immediate liquidity. There is no need to oversimplify this into a single money-printing moment, But there is no doubt that Alexander's seizure of the Persian treasuries altered the financial balance of the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. What had been imperial depth under Persia could now become campaign finance under Macedon. And once captured wealth begins funding the victor, replacement is no longer theoretical. It becomes minted reality. That minted reality appeared in Alexander's own coinage. Ironica notes that the Daric was displaced conclusively by the Nike stater of Alexander the Great. Brown University's numismatic summary describes Alexander's gold coinage clearly. On the obverse, Athena in a crested helmet. On the reverse, Nike standing with the legend Alexandru. During Alexander's lifetime, 25 mints were already producing his coins, and his issues were struck on the Attic standard. A new monetary order does not truly win by capturing treasure alone. It wins when it can reissue trust at scale under its own symbols. Alexander did not need the Daric to vanish overnight in every hand. He needed a coinage broad enough, portable enough, and repeated enough to make markets slowly change their reflexes. Once that happens, empire is no longer borrowing the prestige of the defeated. It is teaching the world to count differently. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his empire shattered into Macedonian successor states. But what broke politically did not disappear administratively overnight. The Seleucid kings came to control most of Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Iran, while the Ptolemies made Egypt the wealthiest of the Hellenistic kingdoms. In Egypt, the civil administration was still headed by an official bearing the Persian title satrap, and after Alexander's death, that position was claimed by Ptolemy himself. Empires often die faster than the fiscal geography they create. The Daric itself was fading, but the imperial corridors, provincial logic, and treasury habits of Persia remained too useful to abandon. The Greeks had conquered the Persian world, but in many ways they had also inherited the problem Persia had already learned to solve. And that meant the old ledger was not gone. It was wearing a new language. That market no longer belonged to a single archer. The Daric was displaced first by the Bega stater of Philip II, and then conclusively by the Nike stater of Alexander the Great. Brown's numismatic work adds an important detail. During Alexander's lifetime, 25 mints were producing his coins across the empire. A monetary monopoly does not end when the old coin becomes bad. It ends when a rival standard scales faster. The Daric had ruled because it was trusted. Alexander's coinage threatened it because it could reproduce trust across a wider network of mints under one victorious name. Persia lost more than a throne. It lost the privilege of being the only high-value gold language that mattered. And once a monopoly gives way to competition, the next question becomes philosophical as much as political. What exactly survives when the issuing power changes, but the financial problem remains the same? The answer is that symbols changed faster than functions. By the time of Alexander's death in 323 BCE, some 25 different mints were producing coins of the same design across his empire, something the Achaemenid Empire had not done in quite that way. Persia had not created a fully uniform coinage across every local economy, but it had already proven the deeper principle. Imperial power becomes stronger when value is portable, legible, and backed by enforceable standards. Markets remember function longer than they remember dynasties. The archer disappeared. Athena and Nike took his place. Yet the winning formula remained recognizable. Precious metal, repeated type, wide circulation, and state-backed credibility. Once that becomes the shared instinct of rulers, a monetary order has outlived its first issuer. And when a system outlives its issuer, its shadow begins to reach beyond conquest itself. When the dust of Alexander's conquests settled, one strange fact remained. The financial imagination of Persia refused to die. Later empires in Iran and the wider Middle East continued to rule lands that still required provincial administration, tax forwarding, royal centers, and reliable corridors of movement. In that sense, the shadow of Persian finance outlived the Persian throne itself. Its deepest legacy was not one coin alone, but a way of organizing scale. The archer vanished from the center of the market, yet the imperial habits behind him endured. Wealth still had to be gathered, recorded, protected, and redirected across great distances. That was the true inheritance. Empires after the Achaemenids did not preserve Persian power, they preserved Persian solutions. And once a civilization teaches later rulers how to make value portable, measurable, and governable, its defeat is never complete. It would be too strong to call the Daric the direct ancestor of the florin, the ducat, or the English sovereign, but it is fair to call it an earlier expression of the same winning formula. In 1252, Florence issued the gold florin, famous for its regular weight of about 3.50 grams and wide imitation. In 1284, Venice issued the gold ducat of nearly the same weight, and its commercial influence spread across Europe. In 1489, Henry VII introduced the gold sovereign, with the king enthroned upon it. The most successful gold coins are not linked by bloodline, but by recurring logic, stable weight, trusted fineness, recognizable imagery, and political authority made portable. The Daric did not father these coins, but long before them, it had already shown why this formula works. The Daric was not a reserve currency in the modern technical sense. The ancient world had no central banks and no modern reserve management. Yet the Daric did achieve something closely related in an older form. It became a trusted, high-value coin beyond its home court, especially across the Western Persian world and among Greeks. Monetary power deepens when your coin becomes a preferred instrument of settlement outside your own borders. Persia did not invent the modern dollar or euro system, but it showed very early that when distant peoples trust your standard more than they fear your army, your influence begins to circulate on its own. In that moment, power becomes quieter and more durable. And once trust begins to travel independently, the next question becomes almost inevitable. Does that trust live in the coin itself, or in the record that stands behind it? The answer lies less in the coin than in the archive. The Persepolis administrative archives preserve clay tablets, fragments, and sealings produced by administrative agencies based at Persepolis. Together, they reveal a regional system of administration, redistribution, and interlocking institutions. Money becomes durable when obligations can be recorded, checked, and retrieved. That is the deeper continuity between ancient archives and modern ledgers. Both try to solve the same civilizational problem: how to make claims and transfers trustworthy across distance. Clay did it slowly, fiber optics do it instantly, but the ambition behind them is recognizably similar. Once trust leaves memory and enters a durable record, value no longer depends only on the person standing in front of you. It begins to depend on a system that can remember on your behalf. And once a system can remember, the problem becomes how to keep that memory credible over time. Modern central banks live in a very different monetary world, yet they would still recognize the core lesson. People plan more confidently when the measure of value in their hands is expected to remain reasonably stable over time. Persia did not run a modern inflation target, and it should not be described that way. But the Daric did embody an older version of the same governing instinct. Consistency of weight, fineness, and authority lowered uncertainty across long distances. The Achaemenid kings did not persuade markets with speeches. They persuaded them by making the standard feel durable. That was why the Daric mattered for so long. It was not merely gold. It was repeated discipline made visible. And when a monetary order matters for that long, later ages do not simply forget it. They preserve it, study it, and place it behind glass as if it still has something left to say. Today, the Daric has completed one final transformation. It no longer moves armies, tribute, or wages. It rests in museum collections as a surviving piece of imperial trust. The British Museum preserves Darics showing the Royal Archer, and the Metropolitan Museum likewise catalogues Achaemenid Darics from the 4th century BCE. These coins are physically small, but historically immense. Archaeology gives monetary history something priceless: resistance to abstraction. A ledger may survive in tablets, and an empire may survive in texts, but a coin survives in the hand. Its wear, its weight, and its repeated type allow later ages to test grand theories against a hard object. That is why the Daric still feels modern. It is not because we use it. It is because we can still recognize, in one small disc, the architecture of trust that built an empire. If the Daric still teaches us anything, it is something quieter than conquest. Introduced by Darius toward the end of the 6th century BCE, weighing about 8.4 grams, marked by the Royal Archer, and trusted across a vast imperial frame, it proved that money becomes strongest when it is portable, legible, and backed by institutions that can enforce its promise. Wealth does not rule by existing. It rules by being organized into roads, archives, standards, payments, and expectations that outlive the hands that first created them. The Persian Empire is gone. Its archers no longer move through the markets of Sardis or the treasuries of Athens, but the principle they carried still moves very softly through the modern world. People build larger futures when they trust the measure of value in their hands. And perhaps that is why this small coin still glows so quietly in the dark.